The tumor was bigger than her breast. And when she needed a hand to hold, the man beside her got up and walked out of the room. That's the moment Sharon Stone says her marriage actually ended. Not in a courtroom. Not over a slammed door. In a hospital, in the middle of the worst fear a woman can face, watching someone choose anger over her. For most of her life, the world thought it knew Sharon Stone. The face from Basic Instinct. The sex symbol. The name every tabloid wanted a piece of. But according to her own words in her memoir, in interview after interview, almost none of that had anything to do with who she actually was. Underneath the image was a woman who survived abuse as a child. A stroke that nearly killed her at 43. A custody battle that used her own films as a weapon against her. And a marriage that collapsed the moment her body needed protecting instead of admiring. By the end of this, you'll understand why she says fame never protected her from any of it and why, in her own telling, it may have made things worse. It starts long before Hollywood. Before we continue, take 1 second to like, subscribe, and tap the bell icon so you don't miss more real stories like this. Sharon Stone was born in 1958. In a small factory town in Pennsylvania, the second of 4 kids in a family that worked hard and had little money. But money was never what she describes as the real wound. She was reading early, testing at an IQ of 154, and still, by her own account, she spent her childhood feeling like she didn't belong anywhere. Too smart for the other kids. Too different to be let in. The deeper pain, she said, was closer to home. In her memoir, she describes her grandfather as abusive and says that she and her sister were harmed by him when she was around 5 or 6 years old. She's also talked about her mother in complicated terms, a woman she calls funny and sharp, but someone whose words could cut in ways that stayed with her for life. What she took from those years, she said, was this: love and pain didn't cancel each other out. They came from the same people. Sometimes in the same sentence. At 14, in the middle of being disciplined physically by her father, she says she looked at him and asked why he needed to hit her to feel like a man. She said he never raised a hand to his children again. At 15, she graduated high school early and left for college on scholarship. By the time most people are figuring out who they are, Sharon Stone had already learned how to survive people who were supposed to protect her. Then came the role that changed everything and cost her control of her own image. After a decade of small parts, 1992 changed her life in a single film, Basic Instinct. Overnight, she was one of the most talked about women on the planet. But she's said publicly that the scene the whole film became famous for didn't happen the way people assumed, that she was told a certain shot wouldn't show on camera. And it did anyway. After that, she said, people stopped watching an actress. They started watching the character. 3 years later, Casino earned her an Oscar nomination and proved she was more than a body on a poster. But by then, she said, the industry had already decided who Sharon Stone was. And no performance was going to undo it. That verdict followed her into the courtroom, too. During her divorce from Phil Bronstein, she said Basic Instinct was raised in the custody fight over her son, that someone asked her child whether he knew his mother had made films like that. A role that earned studios hundreds of millions of dollars, she said, was turned into evidence against her as a mother. Then, in 2001, it wasn't Hollywood that betrayed her. It was her own body. She's described a sudden, violent pain unlike anything she'd felt, the beginning of a brain hemorrhage that nearly took her life. At one point, she said, doctors gave her almost no chance of survival. She lost the ability to walk, to speak clearly, to read, to write her own name. She's also described something stranger, a moment of stillness and peace where she felt ready to let go. Until she thought of her son, Ron. That thought, she said, is what brought her back. Recovery wasn't one dramatic turning point. It was years of relearning things a toddler learns for the first time. One sentence, one written word, one steady step, each one a quiet victory nobody was filming. And she's said that once she stopped looking like the polished, camera-ready version of herself, the industry's interest faded fast. Being sick, she suggested, was treated by some people as though it were something she'd done wrong, And just when the worst seemed behind her, fear came back aimed straight at the part of her the public had always fixated on. While her marriage to Phil Bronstein was falling apart, Sharon Stone has said she found several tumors in her breast, one, she said, larger than the breast itself. Doctors reportedly raised the possibility of removing both. Her first reaction, she's admitted, was denial, a very human response to a diagnosis that terrifying. But she chose the surgery because staying alive mattered more than staying afraid. What happened next is the part she's returned to again and again. By her account, her husband at the time called the decision ridiculous, got angry, and left the room. She said that single moment was when she knew the marriage was over, not because of one outburst, but because of what it revealed, that in the moment she most needed to be held, she was being judged instead. The tumors turned out to be benign. But she said that news didn't undo what had already broken. And in her memoir, she describes waking up from reconstructive surgery to find her body altered by a full cup size, larger than she'd agreed to, something she says was done without her full consent. The same question runs through her entire story. Who gets to decide what happens to a woman's body, the woman living in it, or everyone else who's spent decades looking at it? These days, Sharon Stone tells that story herself, on her own terms. In 2026, she spoke about that hospital room memory again, not for shock value, but as a statement about what women deserve in their most frightened moments: belief, not judgment. She's kept working, taking on projects like Nobody 2 and Euphoria, using new roles instead of retreating from the industry that once tried to define her. Her story was never really about one scene, one film, or one image the world couldn't let go of. It was about a woman who spent her whole life being watched and just as long fighting to be understood. So, here's the question for you: which part of her story stayed with you the longest? The childhood she survived, the price fame demanded, the hospital room, or the fact that after all of it, she kept going anyway? Tell me in the comments. And if you want more of these stories, the ones behind the icons everyone thinks they already know, stay subscribed.